Hello, and welcome to our latest LinkedIn Live session from Karga Publishers. I'm Will Mountford, and joining us today is Professor Stefan Brandhuber, a trustee of the World Academy of Art and Science and member of the Club of Rome. He has served as a financial advisor to the UN, the Lancet Commission, European Institute of Health, and he's currently a medical director and CMO in Germany. He's also written extensively on interdisciplinary approaches to tackling the interconnected problems of the 21st century. From finance to health to climate change, his books, The Economics of Transformation and Financing for Development Towards a New Green Bretton Woods, are available now in all good bookshops and online. Recently, his research and writing has examined how AI and big data initiatives can shape and be shaped by an engaged and open culture. Today, we're examining some of these ideas, how they string together, and thinking most importantly about the humans at the center of such sprawling systems and how to keep their well-being at its best. Professor Brandhuber, hello there.
Hello, Will. Nice having you. Nice having me on your show. I'm looking forward.
Glad to have you. Now, just as a bit more background to you and your work, can you tell me a bit about yourself? Because you work in such an interdisciplinary way, be it economics, psychiatry, all of your teaching and writing as well. What motivated you to cover so many points all at once?
Well, Will, at its core, it's not about having a degree or having a title. It's more about, so to say, a knowledge of interest of better understanding the inner and the outer, the micro and the macro, the silo and the system. And then you end up in an integral, more holistic approach, which also affects the healthcare system.
Mhm. And can you trace that back to any one point in your either training or development or career that you thought, no, there's more to this than just pursuing a narrow pathway, that you could string these different ideas of finance, health, and sustainability together?
I think we are all together in the midst of a transformational process. Scientists call it the Anthropocene era, which affects everything, but it also affects the healthcare system. And I think, and I hope we can go through this talk on different aspects of it. The healthcare system, we have to look at the right KPIs in order to better understand how we can better transform, and what are the mistakes we did in the past to do it better for the future. Look at CO2, look at pandemics, look at species losses, right? CO2 is not visible, not perceptible. You need almost a PhD to understand the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and its impact, etc. Healthcare is different. With the healthcare system, we are affected directly. And we have to look up for the right KPIs in order, where the healthcare system is right in the center of, in order to better transform from a fossil society towards a non-fossil or less fossil society. And in this respect, one of the turning points for me was in this respect that we are living in a system which I call a sick and alive system. Meaning we are creating revenues in the healthcare system as long as we're sick and alive. If you're not sick anymore, if you're not alive anymore, the system doesn't work. But this sick and alive system creates a lot of spillovers, a lot of negative externalities, a lot of inefficiencies. And one of the major things I learned throughout the last years and decades is in public health, we call it a secondary preventive approach, right? We set the damage already, and now we are confronted with rising costs ahead, especially in the healthcare system, not only, but especially in the healthcare system. And how can we dampen these rising costs, exponential costs ahead? And this is one of the major issues I'm involved in.
Mm-hmm. Well, the title of our talk is Innovative Financial Strategies for Resilient Healthcare Systems.
Mm-hmm.
And within the framework of our conversation today and your own research, what does resilience mean?
Resilience to some extent is the counterpart to efficiency. Resilience, if a healthcare system is better equipped to cope with adverse events, with shocks, with ailments, it kind of is an opposite to an efficient healthcare system. And this is what I learned when I was able to work in different healthcare systems in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, and in America, that we have four major variables that addresses resilience and efficiency. One is technology. The second one is socioeconomic parameters like inequality, for example. The third one is accessing the wisdom traditions, the Asian wisdom traditions in Asia and Africa and Europe. And fourth, it's about how can we address finance in this game, right? And this talk is mainly about finance.
Mm-hmm. Well, those third and fourth points there of finance being, well, kind of what makes the world go round. And then the wisdom tradition seems like we're straddling some very old and very new ways of thinking.
Yeah. Our Western model is extremely well equipped if it comes to ICU, intensive care unit, if it comes to imaging, lab findings, surgery, right? There's no other healthcare system in human history who has been so efficient in addressing such ailments or such disorders or shocks. But as soon as we're confronted with non-communicable diseases, as soon as we are confronted with stress-associated chronic disorders, the whole system gets extremely inefficient, I think.
You mean something like aging, perhaps?
Yeah, something like aging. I mean, I would say the major costs in our system, one is aging, right? The second one is the sick and alive bias itself. It creates incentives just to make revenues out of being sick and alive, and not to make money out of prevention and restore. The third one is R&D, research and development technology. The huge rise and the huge inventions of the last 20, 30 years cause huge costs, but at the same time, they're also a benefit for human mankind. A fourth factor in the cost curve is lifestyle. As long as we spend a lot of money in repairing a sedentary lifestyle, this is not cheap. And the fifth parameter, I think, is a more sociological one, is the rise of the global middle class. We have about 1.3 billion people at the moment in the global middle class, and this middle class will triple over the next 15 to 20 years, right? And global middle class, basically means huge expectations with regard to healthcare supply, healthcare delivery on one side, and on the other side, huge expectations in education. And all these factors combined, they create a cost curve, so to say, right? Which is substantially beyond the trajectory of the normal growth rate. Let's say the growth rate worldwide is, let's say, 2 to 3%. Right? We're growing 2 to 3% on average. The costs in the healthcare sector are far exceeding these 2 or 3%. And all the costs are triggered already in one way or another. So we have to come up with a strategy which is kind of out of the box in order to fence that in and to tackle all these expenses ahead.
Which is where I suppose an interdisciplinary approach to borrow from, where it has been successful in treating data in economics or different conditions across physics and politics, to bring those lessons to healthcare. Can you think of any ways in which that might be borrowing from some of those other fields and how it could work?
Definitely. I mean, you mentioned in the first place, definitely AI will play a crucial role in big data analysis, right? In order to predict the next pandemics and therefore lowering the costs, or to predict risk factors who can then better be addressed by public healthcare sectors, or which was the finding last year and the year before, AI is able to provide huge knowledge in order to create new three-dimensional protein codings, right, for new medications and new drugs. So there's huge advantages in there, but they're not cheap. They all cost a lot of money. With regard to AI providing all the energy sources, on the other side, new drugs will be not cheap either.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, to borrow from some further economics reading, you mentioned how resilience in these systems against future shocks is going to be essential.
Yeah.
AI is certainly a future shock, but to wield it as a tool, would that help build what I think Nassim Nicholas Taleb calls an anti-fragile system, where
Yeah.
shocks can actually strengthen, like breaking a bone and healing?
Yeah, I think that's a very good term describing the two opposites. You have the efficient system on one side, right? You make it really streamlining. The throughput per time is at its maximum, but at the same time, a very efficient system is very fragile, right? It's very brittle. On the other side, you have a resilient system, right? Which is characterized by the interconnectedness. And it's kind of inverse U curve, right? And at the top, you have an anti-fragile zone, right? And this is what we're heading for. Healthcare systems should head a maximum between efficiency and resilience. And if you look into the data, what I found particularly interesting is if you compare these two variables, right? Efficiency and resilience, and want to get one step further, you might realize you need a ratio of 2 to 1 between resilience and efficiency. So if you want to increase the efficiency of the system, you should increase the resilience by factor 2 compared to the efficiency variables, right? Otherwise, you will always end up not being in this anti-fragile zone. It sounds a little bit tricky and academic, but you can really break down the numbers and see a system, a healthcare system, at its best if it's operating within an anti-fragile zone, as you mentioned. Yeah.
I mean, tricky and academic concepts are what we are here to talk about, so that's
Yeah.
right where we want to be. Well, to think about where there might be some lessons that we can borrow from, either in the UK or if anyone in the US or Europe wants to see success from other parts of the globe, are there any systems, either in finance or in health or across different fields, that you think we could borrow from?
What I'm learning here at the hospital, beyond finance, we're going to talk about it later, beyond finance is we have to dig in to the wisdom traditions, right? Wisdom traditions are traditions which last 5,000 years. Look at the Ayurveda system or the traditional Chinese medicine or European naturopathy. They're very strong in dealing with stress-associated symptoms and symptom formations. They're less strong if it comes to acute and intensive care system. This is where we can learn to prevent future ailments by looking how wisdom traditions have been managing that, you know. But on the other side, if you look at finance, which is the main topic of this talk right now, we have to step in to better understand what are the traditional ways we've been financing and looking at finance and this rising cost curve we just mentioned in the first place of aging, R&D, lifestyle changes, middle class, sick in the life bias. These are all parameters which has been triggered already. So it's not a question of whether we want it or not. We're going to age, for example, right? There's no way out of it. And we're going to increase the global middle class. We're going to increase research and development, etc. And we're still operating within a sick and alive bias system. And the question which I find extremely relevant and important here, if you're talking about innovative finance for a resilient healthcare system, we first have to step back and look, how are we intending to finance all that in the first place? You know, and what I find interesting, there's 3 or 4 ways we traditionally looked at the financial sector with regard to healthcare finance. And the first one is out-of-pocket payment, right? We simply say, well, if you're sick, you pay your own dues, right? You pay your own bills. But we know from public health research over 20, 25 years that the out-of-pocket payment is the most inefficient one, the most expensive one, the one where crowding out effects kick in the most on an individual level and on a collective level. On an individual level, you sooner or later cannot pay your bill to send your kids to school, right? And on a collective level, we have huge data sets showing, for example, that dozens of countries in the global south pay more for interest rate and debt repayment than for the healthcare sector, right? So out-of-pocket payments is a very small segment on how the future healthcare sector should be financed. And we then end up with what the Americans call saving accounts, meaning you are responsible for your own health and I'm responsible for my own health. And we're not considering a collective structure that allows to cover the future risks together, right? And this out-of-the-pocket payment is one way to do it, but it's a very, very small segment. The second one is we rely on tax and fees. This is what the Germans are doing, most of Europeans are doing. We're saying, okay, let's tax the corporates, let's tax the rich, and let's finance this through a collective taxation system, right? And you end up with huge volumes of money which are redistributed from one place to another, right? And in fact, the majority of the costs will still be tax and fees, redistributing money from one way or to another. But you end up sooner or later in a situation you can compare with pulling a tablecloth, right? I pull the tablecloth and you pull the tablecloth. We need the money to pay our healthcare bills. And then you end up in what economists call a club rule. If you're part of the club, you get paid. If you're not part of the club, you're left out, right? The third approach is basically charity or philanthropy, right? You can simply say, well, let's call up Bill Gates. We're a little bit tight on a global level. We need 600, 800 billion extra. Are you prepared to provide that money for the rising healthcare costs, right? And to some extent it works, but you can show with the WHO as a case study, it works in some fields, but it's definitely not enough. And even Bill, if you take all these three approaches, the out-of-pocket payments, the tax and fees, and the philanthropy together, right? And make a rigorous balance sheet about how can we cover the costs ahead, not only the actual costs, but also the costs ahead. You will end up with huge cost factors you cannot sterilize or neutralize right now. So to some extent, we are in this situation where we know what we have to do. For example, we know how to treat malaria. We are very good in treating malaria. We know how to treat COPD, chronic obstructive lung diseases. We're very, very good in treating hypertension, depression, or wash diseases like water, sanitation, hygiene disease. We have all the knowledge. Okay, but what's lacking is the liquidity, the money to do just that. Right? The return, economically speaking, the return on investment for all these disorders and ailments like infectious diseases like TB or malaria, or chronic communicable diseases like COPD and hypertension, they're 1 to 15, 1 to 30, 1 to 50, meaning you invest $1 and you get for the society a social return by factor 30 to 50. There's very few investment strategies in commercial and investment banking who can create such a revenue, right? So we know what to do, right? And we have the knowledge, but what's lacking is where can we get this additional liquidity to avoid spillovers, to avoid ailments, etc.
Well, if you were given your own private country, an island somewhere nice, good weather, and told, okay, let's build your dream healthcare system, how would you structure that? How would you put together an ideal plan in an ideal place
Oh,
to
wow. Wow. That's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it because I'm always uh, affected by the costs curse we've triggered already.
Mm,
But what I would suggest, and we've been discussing that through the World Academy and the Club of Rome with WHO and others, is that besides the taxes and fees, and besides out-of-pocket payments, which are basically privatizing the healthcare sector, right? And besides uh, philanthropy and charity, we need a fourth pillar. And I think the fourth pillar is where central banks have to kick in. It sounds a little bit weird and a little bit kind of out of the box and untraditional, but just imagine the following as a thought experiment. We were in a thought experiment here, right? Let's let's think about the following thought experiment. Let's think that central banks are prepared to print money, additional money, let's say 200, 400 billion every year, upfront loading the WHO in order to tackle the next pandemics. What would happen on a micro level? The balance sheets of the central banks would enlarge by the 200, 400 billion dollars, right? And they create that money through what specialists call quantitative easing. They create that money through printing money. Simply, they don't loan it. They print the money, right, and provide it to the WHO, for example. The WHO on the other side has upfront loaded 200, 400 billion extra in order to tackle the causes we've triggered already in the first place. This will still be more expensive, but if you take the entire bill, it's definitely less expensive than doing nothing. So what I'm advertising here is that besides taxation and besides privatizing our system, which in part can be done on a large scale, on a global scale, we need much more liquidity in the system, much more purchasing power in order to bring down the knowledge we have already down to the road. And the fastest way to do it is call up central banks to do that. And you know what's really interesting in this view is that they've been doing this already. They've been doing this in order to save the banking system during 2008 crisis. They've been doing it with a lag during the pandemic already, not with the full success, but to some extent they did it. And if now we would understand that regulators and central banks are able to create within their currency sovereignty additional liquidity in order to be conditioned for healthcare issues, we will end up in a situation where all these cost factors we discussed in the first place will be substantially diminished. We will use a lot of money for prevention, for example, right? And again, the central bank balance sheet will increase, or the one of the European Investment Bank or the multilateral developing banks. So public banks' balance sheet will increase. The World Bank's balance sheet would increase. But on the other side, public health and health as a common good would be substantially increased too.
Well, it all sounds very encouraging that rather than going to people and asking for their money, go straight to the money and ask for the money.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, there is an interesting twist in there. If you look at this whole transformational process from the UN SDGs, these 17 developing goals, where healthcare plays a crucial role, right? At the moment, we still think that finance is determining UN SDGs. Financing is determining sustainability. finance is determining healthcare. We can reverse it and say healthcare is determining the finance we need. The future is determining the kind of money we need in order to unleash all these return on investments we know in the first place. And this is, I think, the major shift, major mind shift we have to undergo if you really want innovative financial strategies for a resilient healthcare system.
Well, you said that this would be one of the fastest ways to do it. What would that timeline be? Would it be something that we could see returns on that investment, even if not to the kind of 15, 30, 50 fold that you said, in the next maybe 10 years, 15
Yeah,
years?
well, faster. I would say faster. Let's consider, if we had that money for the WHO, and if we had the conviction that healthcare is not a private issue, but a public good, right? Where everybody can benefit in one way or another. We can end malaria and TB within a couple of years, because we have the knowledge out there already. It's not a matter of research on TB. Of course, we need more research on TB. We also need more research on malaria and AIDS. But if we take the healthcare status of OECD countries as a benchmark and say we want to achieve that for the globe, right? We need additional liquidity to make that happen. And this is the fastest way to do it. I would guess within a couple of years, we can measure the difference already.
I mean, if I were coming into a position of political power with a 4 or 5 year term, then ending malaria or TB would certainly be something that I would walk away holding my head up high about. Maybe
Yeah.
that is something that we can lead into our next question with, is there anything that the next generation of engineers, students, politicians can take forwards to kind of shape their approach to finance and healthcare, or develop more resilient outlooks?
Yeah, I think if you address next generation, I think there's two things. The first one is an individual one, right? Stay healthy, invest in your lifestyle, right? Well, put it short, make your push-ups, right? Eat a veggie burger, right? Like this. But eating a veggie burger and make your push-ups will be not enough, because it's affected by a systems change, which is necessary at the same time. And on a systems change, for the next generation, my message would be dare to think out of the box. Dare to follow your heart. Don't follow the money. Follow your heart. Follow your thinking. Money will follow your thought process in one way or another anyway.
Yes, I think it's, to borrow an interdisciplinary anecdote, we all stayed at home, not driving our cars and not going on flights for a good 9, 10 months of the year at the start of the pandemic, and it didn't make a dent in emissions because the system is built not around personal contributions, but around system.
Exactly. I couldn't say it much better. This was the COVID recession we've been experiencing, but we didn't use the COVID recession in order to rebuild a better system. We basically caught up with the same system, with the same incentives, which are basically a sick and alive incentive, and didn't address the financial system itself, right? And we have to step back and say, okay, what are the goals we want to achieve? What are the KPIs we want to achieve? Why not creating a global fund, right? Where the private sector is not paid by their revenues or by the expected return on investment, but by the amount of lives saved, by the amount of life expectancy extended, right? And this additional money is coming from the green QE, from a healthcare QE. Like the big pharma, the big 20, 25 pharmas, they get their money not for the amount of pills they sold in OECD countries, but by the amount of malaria cases they're really basically inhibited or prevented from happening, and they get a pay for performance.
Well, we've got a couple of comments coming in through the chat here. Going to
Oh,
work my
wow.
way up the list. I've got one from Aurora Hajdari who asks, how can digital technologies be integrated into financial strategies to improve the resilience of the healthcare system? And you've mentioned AI approaches to big data, but
Yeah.
is there anything either more specific or more far-reaching than just handling large numbers faster than the human brain can?
Well, I mean, this would require a webinar on its own, but on different levels. On one side, it's data management at the hospital, right? Digital technologies can much better track a patient case than without or let's say only with an Excel sheet or something, right? The second level is implementing new technologies like robotics doing the job in part, right? The Da Vinci operation system, for example, or similar. The third one would be in research, like the 3D research done on protein coding, which got the Nobel Prize last year. And the fourth level would be in finance, basically, no, in the healthcare sector would be basically creating databases for preventive coding. We can anticipate the next pandemics 6-8 weeks earlier would save a lot of lives, right? So this is my short answer to a very important question.
Mhm. And there's a previous question I think we might have missed some of the point of, but to bend it towards a healthcare perspective, if there was a healthcare startup that needed financing, Katori Ishikawa asks, should they go to the banks or to big companies directly to find that finance?
You understand? Are you suggesting that we would get directly to the banks or big companies for money? Well, you can go if you have a startup in the healthcare sector. It depends on your business model, right? If you want to create an app in order to improve lifestyles, you might get money by the capital market, or you might get money by a private owner or by charity. But I'm talking about healthcare from a public perspective, in the sense that, in my understanding, healthcare is a public good. And as a public good, we need public money to enable better KPIs in the healthcare sector.
Now, I will say, during a lot of our conversation, I've been going through in my mind where you've mentioned how 4 to 5 years you could cure malaria or tuberculosis or any of the kind of long-lasting, perennial diseases. There's a book that came out this year by John Green called Everything is Tuberculosis, and it's shaped around a very similar idea of that this one root cause touches so much of life across so much of the globe. Are there any recent publications, books, besides your own, of course, that you think someone should go and read if they want to know more about this kind of approach and these kind of ideas and thinking?
I mean, I can refer to our initiative at the World Academy called the Tao of Finance. Like, the Tao, this Confucian term, Tao of Finance, where we try to explain the relevance of finance in healthcare sector and sustainability in education throughout the entire UN SDGs from a different out-of-the-box approach. Frankly, there's not very many books out there who are prepared to think out of the box if it comes to healthcare and finance. It's all very, very traditional stuff, like increasing repurchasing programs on the stock market or raising the taxes for the rich. And if we had more time, well, I can show you that there's no taxation schema on the planet available at the moment, and very likely not to be in the near future, that would be able to fully finance all the costs we are expecting to happen over the next years. This is why we got to think out of the box, I guess.
And are there any that, going back to maybe your own personal reading, your own personal history, that you would say, this crystallized a lot of my ideas, maybe watching someone speak or a course at a university? Is there anything that, if you could share that experience with the wider audience of people watching and listening, you would like to put that message to them?
I'm learning that healthcare is primarily a public good, not a private issue. I'm learning here by running this hospital here or doing lecture tours throughout the world on the topic is that we have to reverse the view from financing driving healthcare to healthcare driving finance. And we have to learn and be very humble about the fact that we have to dig in to the wisdom traditions we're all inheriting in one way or another.
Well, we've got one last question here. We're coming up to the end of our session, but Aurora asks again, are there any trainings or certifications for those who want to get involved in financial management of healthcare systems? I think this will probably vary by geographic region.
No, it's all conventional stuff. Sorry to say that very plainly.
No,
If you go for an MBA in healthcare, you got to learn your taxation schemas and you learn your microeconomic management. And as far as I know, I'm very happy to revise my argument. As far as I know, we do not have MBA programs that allow innovative finance and financial management in healthcare, but I'm happy to contribute if there is.
Well, we can look forward to adding that to a sprawling CV of yours. But if there is anywhere that people can find more from you directly or anything more about your work at the World Academy of Art and Science or from the Club of Rome, where can they find it online?
They can contact me, and I'm happy. I have several data sets and several links, and I'm happy to send them out for further information. Just visit my homepage, which is my name. Basically, type in my name, and I can send out book chapters or talks and links. Some of the links we already published through Carter Publisher, by the way. We're very successful over the last years providing new insights into out-of-the-box approaches in the healthcare sector.
Well, I look forward to maybe sharing some of that learning with everyone watching today and everyone who catches up on the video on demand. But for right now, that brings us to the end of our session. Professor Brunhuber, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me in your show and looking forward for future discussions here.
Absolutely. And to anyone watching and listening now, our next session will be on June the 26th. Look forward to seeing you there and then. But for today, that's all from me. Goodbye.
Goodbye.